It's a bit of a challenge to try to sort of bring the discussions of the last 2 days together. What we now have is a roundtable with the provisional title, Where Now? In order to keep it open and to allow many viewpoints. I'll briefly introduce the panelists insofar as they haven't yet been introduced. To my left is Sir Peter Torry, former British ambassador to Germany, 2003 to 2007. He lives in London and in Berlin, and he's very actively involved still in German-British relations. I'm very happy that you made it here. Thank you very much. To my immediate left is Helene von Bismarck. Helene von Bismarck is a historian. She holds a PhD from Humboldt University, and her main research interests is the UK's role in international relations in the 20th and 21st century. But she doesn't confine herself to that. She's very sort of broadly interested in current affairs in the UK, and also quite actively involved in German-British relations. She's recently done a study of the history of the Königswinter Conference for the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. Thank you also very much for coming. To my right is Holger Nehring, who we've already seen yesterday evening, contemporary historian from the University of Stirling. Ed Turner is just up in the panel, and Simon Usherwood gave the keynote yesterday evening, University of Surrey and UK in a Changing Europe. Thank you all for coming. The plan is that we start with brief statements, 4 or 5 minutes at the max, and then once we're through with that, we'll do 1 or 2 rounds to discuss statements and any ideas that might come up, and then we'll open it up to the general public to the rest of the room for discussions and see where that takes us. Okay, so Peter.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear? I was given some very strict instructions about the use of this microphone. Not too close, not too far. Is that all right? You can hear. I'd just like to start by saying, making one comment on the previous presentation about the role of the sovereign. I mean, I fully agree with what was said about the need to think about a written constitution. And if you look at this judgment by the Scottish courts, it really does call into question the advice given to the sovereign. From what little I know of her, I'm sure she would have made use of her traditional powers, which is to encourage, to warn, to be consulted when she was talking to Boris Johnson about this promulgation. But in the end, I mean, she is dependent on the advice of ministers. You have to ask yourself, what is the point of the head of state, who is just a constitutional rubber stamp? I didn't want to, I just wanted to say I agree with that. That's a major issue we have to talk about in the future. Immediately, where do we go from here? Well, it's a bit difficult for me to say, given that we don't even know what's going to happen this afternoon. Is Boris Johnson going to be forced to recall Parliament this afternoon? I think I can say one thing with reasonable certainty, is that we're not going to leave the EU certainly on the 31st of October, and maybe not for quite a long time thereafter. What is going to happen? I think the most likely course of events is that the government will be forced willy-nilly to go to the European Council in the middle of October and ask for an extension. I think our partners say that Knirschen will allow us that extension, even though the French are threatening to veto it. What happens then? We will probably have a general election in November. Who wins? Well, the problem for the Remain coalition is that their vote is divided by 7. The Brexiteers have less of a problem in that their vote is divided in 2. But I think we have to assume that the likelihood is, if the Conservatives win, and you probably have to think that they have a very good chance, given that the Remainers are so divided, and given that with our first past the post system, 30 to 35% of the vote is enough, and Boris Johnson is polling that at the moment. If the Conservatives win, the chances are we're faced again with a no-deal Brexit at the end of January. There's a very small sort of caveat on that, which is the possibility that they will negotiate some kind of deal involving a backstop for Northern Ireland only between now and then, but I think the chances of that are very small. So we come to the end of January, and we have a no deal. What happens then? Well, it depends very much on the atmosphere when we part. I mean, I can easily foresee circumstances in which the bitterness, the refusal to pay our financial obligations causes really quite significant ruptions on both sides and makes it very difficult for us to get back together again. But get back together again, we will have to do, because this dream of the hard Brexiteers of a global Britain, I fear, is based on assumptions that are no longer valid. It's based on assumptions that the world is moving ever more in the direction of free trade, when actually the world is moving ever more in the direction of protectionism. We are going to have to come back to our European partners, and what is going to happen when we come back? The first three issues we will have to discuss, and this time from a position of weakness, because we will not be members, and under the terms of Article not 50, but Article 218, where unanimity is required, and so even some small parliament in some subsidiary part of Belgium can veto us, we will have to discuss the issues that at the moment we are unable to resolve. It's easy to break up and rip apart and throw away the 40 years of our relationship with Brussels. It's extremely difficult to put that back together again. And Brexit is not going to end with a clean break whenever that happens. We're going to come back to this, and we're going to be spending an enormous amount of time and energy and imagination in the coming years, I fear, in trying to put together again, in the words of the nursery rhyme, what Humpty Dumpty put apart. Thank you. I think that was less than 4 minutes, wasn't it?
Great. You get bonus points for that.
What's next? I think in midst of all this political chaos, one thing we should remember is that theoretically there is still a possibility of a deal being struck between the EU and the UK. They are still talking. Boris Johnson is still Prime Minister, though let's just look at the time of this discussion, and I'm not sure this is going to hold in 3 days or something, who knows. But as long as he is, there would be a landing zone, which would be a Northern Ireland only backstop. That is something the EU could agree to. It's obviously the opposite of what Boris Johnson has repeatedly stated he wants. But if it came to a situation where Parliament would have to choose between a deal, which would involve such a backstop, and no deal, obviously the ERG would probably still vote against it because they like the idea of no deal, but maybe, I'm saying maybe, theoretically, some opposition MPs might be tempted to vote for that. That said, it is a theoretical possibility. I think politically it's not going to happen, but I find it important to put it out there to say that there is, if anybody tells you that this is over, that's actually a choice, an active choice, not to pursue the possibility of a deal anymore. What is certain, I mean, a lot is uncertain at the moment, but what is certain is there is going to be an election in Britain, I think probably before the year is out. And I think what we can expect is a worsening of the public discourse, which already has been poisoned by Brexit for some time, and the current government is playing an active part in that. So the sort of aggressive rhetoric, the inappropriate historical analogies, lies, pretty much, which are being uttered from some people involved in the debate, that's just going to get worse, in my opinion. And what we are already seeing is this kind of discourse, the people versus the parliament. And we've talked about the difficulty when you start mixing direct democracy with representative democracy. And the current government is at the moment pretending to protect the people against the meddling parliament. And I think at the moment Boris Johnson has really boxed himself into a position where he can either resign or double down on that kind of rhetoric. And now, added bonus with the ruling in Scotland, we'll probably not only have the people versus parliament, we'll also have the people versus parliament and the judges. And that's very reminiscent of what happened 3 years ago, the judges as the enemies of the people. Kind of rhetoric which I find very dangerous wherever you stand on Britain's relationship with the EU. So I think at the moment, for those of us who like representative democracy, and I would firmly count myself in that camp, the good news is that the institutions in Britain, they are really fighting back in terms of Parliament agreeing against the will of the government, this bill which forces the government to ask for another extension, and now with this ruling. But to put a more pessimistic view on things, the question is, how much will that matter to voters? And I don't think we should underestimate the differences in perception between the general public and expert commentators of any political couleur. And I think if there is an election, there is still, amazingly, a possibility that Boris Johnson might win that, or at least that there would be another hung parliament. We also have to bear in mind that the anti-no deal coalition is really a very mixed group of people who don't really like one another, and as long as they have a common adversary, in this instance Boris Johnson, they work together to get this bill for another extension passed. But will they cooperate in a joint successful strategy to avoid no deal, not just postpone it but avoid it in the long run? And if so, what is their strategy? We already have a new group of MPs who now say they are MPs for a deal. Then you have the second referendum camp. I think, in effect, these people would have to work together if they wanted to find a constructive way forward. And the obvious question is also, is the EU going to wait for that?
Thank you. No, you can keep that. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll try not to repeat what's already been said. I've got 5 points. I think the first important point from my perspective is to see this question of what will happen as a really foundational question. This is not just a sort of policy question, it's not just a legal question, but this goes to the very foundations of the UK political system and of the UK's constitution. And Sir Peter said it with regard to the position of the sovereign. And I think with the decision today in the Court of Session, if we are looking at Ernst Kantorowicz's the King's two bodies, one of the Queen's bodies has died a little today already, regardless of what the Supreme Court will rule. And this will have, over decades to come, some kind of impact. What the impact will be, we can't say, because we are not visionaries, but it will have some kind of impact. Following from that, the second thing is more specifically is what surprised me is, and this goes into the reporting, it goes into how people you talk to understand Brexit, is the mixing up of the different levels of analysis that Simon's lecture yesterday so brilliantly unpacked, which is which system are we actually talking about? Are we talking about the UK political system? Are we talking about the EU system? Are we talking about the international system? And all these different elements always kind of get jumbled together when people talk about Brexit, but it's very difficult to untangle them. I think even for academics it's very difficult to untangle them because they're all in a way connected. And again, this will be the interesting thing to watch, is what will happen to that, because I think a lot of what's going to happen is not going to be the result of what happens in each system, but about what happens between the systems and how that works itself out. So the kind of impact that, say, the international system will have on how Brexit is being discussed. I think this is going to be one of the important issues, you know, especially with Trump, this whole discussion about the breakdown of the liberal international order. How is the UK going to position itself there if there is Trump too, for example? Because there will be questions where there will be, you know, it's either going to be pro the EU position or pro the US position, and you cannot take this away. Regulation has been mentioned. This is going to be a big issue as well. Third point is, big question for me is Johnson just forcing an issue within the Conservative Party that's been festering for quite a long while? Is this policy that he's driving, is this something that maybe has been underway and that we have actually not seen because it didn't fit into our, especially I'm very Anglophile image of the kind of nice and cozy UK where everything is done in the way that we would like to see it. So has there been something festering that he's now just forcing towards the decision? Fourth, that's also already been said, Brexit is a process. It's not going to end any time soon, and it's going to be very difficult to see how this turns out. It will certainly continue, regardless of whether there's a deal or not, for years to come, probably actually decades to come, if it happens. And then finally, the talking about deal versus no deal, on the one hand, on the policy level, that's very important. But then on the other hand, is also, it brings a very problematic element in, which is it suggests that you have no deal and you somehow go back to some kind of status quo ante. Like if you buy a car, or you don't buy a house. You don't buy a car, you don't buy a house, you don't get the car, you don't get the house. But you've never had the house. You've never had the car because you're buying it. So you're not directly affected by the no deal, apart from the fact that you don't have a new car. But with Brexit, if you don't have no deal, you can't just go back. In a sense, your house is gone. In the process. And that's the problem. And that's been the misleading rhetoric from the UK government over again. And this has caught on to journalists, this focus on deal making, on kind of clear and easy-going, forward-looking solutions of a global Britain. And I think this is I find really frustrating that this is kind of going on, but at the same time it is, and it will be, again, for decades to come. So I've got a very sort of pessimistic, gloomy, and sort of doer Scots picture that I'm throwing into the mix here.
Thanks very much. I mean, I probably ought to leave some of the domestic politics of this to others, but just to be clear, I think there is, as Helene said, every possibility that the government will land a deal. I can see why many in the European Union would be pleased to see a deal resolved. Of course, we did enter the transition period, which would give a great deal more certainty on both sides. And even with the current parliamentary arithmetic, there is a significant group of Labour parliamentarians who might well find favour in supporting such a deal. So we'll have to see what happens. And if I may, just as well, just on a comment on the rhetoric around judges. I mean, that would be a real worry. And I think my sense is that in recent days politicians have been quite careful. So our ministers have been really clear that the UK, for example, will respect the rule of law, will respect the courts. And again, I would expect from the Secretary of State for Justice quite a sort of sober response to this ruling. And at the end of the day, this issue will be resolved in the Supreme Court. It was always going to be, whichever side won the initial battles. But what I really wanted to do actually was think a bit beyond that. best moment for me in the last 6 months was something in my sort of private life. I live in a relatively deprived part of Oxford, and we took a group of around 40 youngsters as part of a town twinning link and their families to Bonn, our twin city, to play football, and they got hammered by very well-drilled German football teams time again. Wasn't helped by the fact Bonn is the home of Haribo sweets, and so they'd all been at the outlet store eating loads of sweets, and the goalkeeper was sick in the first game, and that didn't go very well. They also were mascots in the main stadium for a regional league game and led the teams out on the pitch. That was actually the day after one of the days when Britain was expected to leave the European Union, and I just thought it was a really good reminder that actually some of these, wherever you stand on these issues, some of the sort of citizen-to-citizen links are really, really important, and you can do such a lot. And these were, many of the young people had to get a passport to go on this trip, so they weren't of the kind of social demographic that would necessarily have been going to Germany otherwise. So that was really, really good, and I hope in a way wherever one comes from on this, one will take the opportunity to try and strengthen some of those bilateral links. And a bit of a personal hobby horse, but if Brits were better at learning languages, then I wonder whether we'd be in the position that we are at the moment. On bilateral links as well, it just seems to me, regardless of how this pans out, there's so much that Britain and Germany have to work on together. So we're clearly like-minded partners in being committed to a transatlantic relationship. We've got the shared challenges around Russia's role, around China's role, but also big substantive challenges where we're facing common questions. How do we handle the gig economy? How to respond to the opportunities presented by artificial intelligence? What about climate change, where actually our governments are in quite a similar position and will, I think, need to show leadership? What about international development and the Africa strategy? So, what I hope the future holds is that we can hold good on the agreement between our foreign ministers on a UK-German strategic dialogue. I hope we can also sign a joint compact on global responsibilities. And sometimes there's a scepticism from the German side about some of this bilateral stuff. There's a feeling it might chip away at the EU, but of course the United States has links both bilaterally with our countries and also with the EU. No one says that's improper. I think there's definitely space for both. And to some degree, once the Brexit question is resolved, then actually there may be more space, more appetite to work on some of these global issues together. At the same time, we've absolutely got to strengthen the civil society links as well.
I've said most of the things that I might have said last night, but I think 3 points that I want to emphasize at this stage. The first one is that the dominant mode is one of problem avoidance rather than problem solving. So particularly in the UK, everyone is trying to make sure that it's not their fault. It's them. They stopped us, or they frustrated us, or they made us do it. We also see an element of that in the EU's approach, that it doesn't want to be the one that ends up in a no deal by refusing an extension, and you saw that debate in April at the time of the second extension. You will see it again next month when the French will make noises, and then do they really want to be the ones who own this problem? And those meetings that Boris Johnson had with Macron and with Merkel ahead of the G7, where this idea of 30 days to come up with a proposal, which largely seems to be a British creation from nothing, actually works well in the EU's strategy, which is that, okay, it goes back to you, but you have to come to us with ideas. The second and related part of that, then, is that this is all happening in an environment of very low trust. And, we're talking about representative democracy. Representative democracy and all democracy relies on trust. If we don't trust people to exercise power on our behalf, so we have constitutional arrangements of different kinds, but we still have to make some kind of leap of faith. And the last 3 or 4 years have really tested that we see that in the British system, where MPs don't trust their leaders, where Parliament doesn't trust the government and the government doesn't trust Parliament, the courts get a very hard time, and where publics are reinforced in their prejudicial view of politics and the political system. And as already been said, it's very easy to destroy trust in a system. It's very hard to bring it back. And so, however this turns out, whichever one of those three options of leave with a deal, leave with no deal, not leave happens, the relationship between the different parts of the British political system, but also the relationship between the UK and the EU, will take a long time to recover. The memory of this time, even if everyone suddenly becomes very conciliatory and helpful and constructive, will be there for a considerable period. And the last point is one about the difficulty of moving this debate on. And again, it's a bit like the discussion about a written constitution or a codified constitution, that the UK still doesn't have a habit of having these big conversations. I talked last night about how we haven't had a discussion, or we haven't had a successful discussion about what the purpose of Brexit is. In the same way, we haven't ever really had a conversation about what the constitutional settlement of the UK should be. It's the one we've had. We make it work. It's got enough flexibility that usually we can ride out some local difficulties. And yeah, it's just a bit too much like hard work to start thinking about what the alternatives might be. You know, usually somebody wheels out the prospect of someone like Richard Branson becoming the president of the United Kingdom. And we'd have to change the name of the country. And it's too much work. So in the same way, I think there is this problem that even at this time of heightened social and political tension, that is not nearly enough to produce a constitutional moment, which might resolve the constitutional issue, which might resolve the Brexit issue. And yeah, you know, I don't foresee a future in which Brexit leads to the outbreak of open conflict. But without a move on from that, I think the future is clear. It will be more unhappiness. British European policy has been a series of, let's try this. Oh no, we don't like that. Let's try that. Oh, we don't like that either. Well, let's try something else. And so we move from unhappiness to unhappiness. And as you know, British people are very good at being unhappy. It is a comparative... Yeah, but no, the British... Yeah, it's something the British really revel in. They get it from the weather. So I think here we will see that this is going to be a persistent problem, and there's nothing really in the historical experience since '45 to suggest that we are going to see a fundamental change in that basics, that there will be dissatisfaction, disengagement, but now we do that in a situation where trust is compromised and where the system appears gridlocked. So more of the same.
Simon, thanks. I'd like to challenge that a little. I'm mic'd up. Thanks. I'd like to challenge that for the purpose of the two rounds that I would like to do now, where we want to perhaps discuss the domestic situation in one round, and then the question of the UK's position in the world in a second round, and then open it up to the room. I'd like to invite you to try to gaze into the crystal ball a little bit, and even if we're wrong, it'll still be interesting because we're recording this, and it'll be interesting. The point is, it'll be interesting to see what our thinking was like and what determined our thoughts at this point in time. And Helene said rightly, we don't even know what will happen in the course of this afternoon. That is exactly why it'll be interesting. So I'll take you up about sort of nothing big has ever changed. I'm a political economist. I would say, well, there has been a point at which in the UK something big has changed, and that is the sort of around the Thatcher era, a really, but quite sort of with power, a forced change in the political economy situation. So it can be done, and the question question is, can that be done in another field as well? And my point would be that the United Kingdom is in a situation where it is perhaps best described as being somewhat adrift. It seems to be lacking an anchor, and that anchor could be, for example, a written constitution, but it could also, but the point where it's also lacking, where you can see that there is no arbiter of a common national interest, no ultimate arbiter of that. It cannot be the Queen, who is impartial, and the other impartial figure is the Speaker of the House of Commons, who also cannot claim to be that arbiter. So my question is, how can such an anchor, who or what can such an anchor function provide? Would you like to answer first, perhaps?
If I was really pessimistic and really cynical, I would say a leader.
Right, we're gazing into the crystal ball. So I'd like you not to sort of confine that to a theoretical answer, but also, would you find that likely?
Well, let's just put it that way. No, well, I would say that there is a danger in this situation of heightened unhappiness and distrust, which I would absolutely agree with Simon here. There is a real danger that people would find the idea that somebody would just sort things out no matter, and that the ends would justify the means, that people would find that idea attractive. And I think that somebody who cared more about his own advancement than about constitutional traditions could try to exploit that situation politically. And I think the attempt is already happening. Whether it will be successful is another question.
I would say exactly, almost literally the same as Helene, that we know that the British public doesn't think that the government has done a good job about Brexit, but it also thinks the EU has not done a good job about Brexit. And again, this feeds into that longer-term secular trend in decline in trust in figures of authority. And again, the temptation is to say, I don't care about Brexit. Most people don't care about Brexit. You know, they sense it's important, but they just want it done. They want to be able to talk about other boring things in their lives. And so if there is somebody who comes through, and I don't think it's somebody who's there necessarily now. It's not Boris Johnson. It's not Nigel Farage. But you could imagine somebody who is personable, friendly, who says, this is crazy. You know, we should just close this off, move on, and, you know, we have a no deal, we just walk away and we just start again, and it'll be difficult, but we will, you know, I'm going to be honest with you, it'll be difficult, but it'll be worth it. And somebody who has none of the baggage that the existing political actors have. And so it does leave the door open for a populist, not least because there is a problem in the UK that the British think that they are somehow immune from populism. They didn't get led astray like other countries have around the world. And so we'll be fine because we're sensible and we're British. And that's clearly not true, because there's plenty of populism around at the moment.
And there is some support in opinion polls for exactly the scenario that the two of you are painting. So, but would that mean a system change?
No, you can use the system as we see now. In other countries, you can keep the same system in nominal terms, but you turn the system to work for you. And actually, the British system works perfectly well as an authoritarian system, because as long as you have a robust majority in Parliament, you can direct the system more or less where you want. There aren't the checks and balances there in the way that there are in codified systems. So. Yeah, the path to power can be done in a legal way, and then you can hollow out institutions as you go.
Okay, that sounds rather pessimistic to me. Let's see how the others think about it. Again, it's sort of gazing into the crystal ball.
So we've had one set of scenarios. Most senior political figures will, I think, reflect on what Helene was talking about earlier about some of the rhetorical divisions. I mean, I've felt this for a long time because, all of my, at the time of the referendum, when I was an academic, I campaigned on the Remain side. All of my kind of academic friends, all for Remain. But I've got this hobby. I referee football matches, and that was much more mixed. And so my Facebook wasn't an echo chamber. It was kind of two echo chambers, one in each ear, and that sort of continued. And people certainly feel that, and we're all talking about those divisions. And so, I mean, it's actually quite striking that in different ways, and I hear what leaders of certainly both major parties do talk about the need to heal the divisions. So, and in both cases, actually, it's quite a striking thing. Both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn think that they want to get back onto different terrain, talk about socioeconomic issues, and move on somehow from this. Clearly, we hear that's difficult in the current circumstance, and of course there will still be negotiations to be had whether we leave with a deal or without a deal. This will still carry on, but maybe there's a happier scenario where rather than trying to sort of double down, to take Helene's phrase, instead people want to pull things back from the brink and have a closer focus on domestic politics. And just on the sort of checks and balances point, which Simon made, maybe I would challenge that a little bit. I mean, it does seem to me that in the circumstances where you've got the devolved administrations, you've got a House of Lords which has been quite challenging, you do probably have a different legal culture to 20 or 30 years ago, more challenges there, as well as the role of political parties and members having evolved in a way that we've talked about. I'm not sure that you can kind of go back to the kind of elective dictatorship model, and it doesn't feel very, maybe I'm going on my remit, but it doesn't feel very likely from the way the opinion polls look at the moment that you're going to be seeing those sort of landslides either. So maybe you could be a little bit more positive.
I'm going to be super positive now, just to be a bit, bring a little bit of controversy into the mix. And I'm going to just offer two more options, one very briefly, one a little bit longer because it's a bit counterintuitive. The first one, which is basically the UK is going to become Belgium. Which is, permanent instability, looking for governments, and the thing that holds it together is essentially the monarchy. And then the question is, how long is that going to survive? But that's the sort of just the flippant bit. The more serious bit, and that's the counterintuitive bit, is actually the answer to Andreas's questions. What's going to be the kind of link? I'm going to say the state. The bureaucracy, because that at the moment is at the root of a lot of the dissatisfactions that people have with the UK political system, and that's at the same time, probably because of that, the thing that nobody talks about. Because if you're looking at local government in the UK at the moment, it's in a catastrophic state. So Duisburg-Ruhrort is in a good state by comparison to most northern English city councils. This is if they came there, they would see brilliant. This is the kind of the blühende Landschaften that Kohl promised in 1989-90. This is how bad the situation is. They have had funding cuts of about 80 to 90%. They haven't been able to replace it. Sheffield is discussing whether they should no longer have individual litter bin collections for each household, but just put a big bin on each road or even on each block, because it's too expensive to do the runs. This is the kind of state of play at the moment. So there are essential services that are under threat. And this is not even talking about social care, care for the mentally ill, the kind of things that people take for granted, but that are actually no longer there because of basically years of cuts that actually already started before the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. And
you get from that
this is now the second element of the question. The reason why, in order to offer some plausibility to this, because people do not like the state and they do not like bureaucracy because it's deeply unsexy. But you can see how it goes if you look to Scotland. Because the SNP has done a brilliant job under, pretty much similar conditions, with some extra funding that they were able to levy, and actually creating an allegiance to their Scottish government and their brand of sort of broadly social democratic policies within the Scottish population. Although the Scottish councillors, if you talk to councillors, they will tell you we've got the same problems because of a centralisation going on within Scotland, but people do not feel that way. Partly because the SNP has managed to, in a sense, create a sort of rescue parachute that has managed to kind of work as a stopgap between that and their policy of centralization. And this is precisely what hasn't happened in England. And I think it's no coincidence that the situation in Northern Ireland, where basically we haven't had a government, and at the same time the party that's responsible for this, because there was this big scandal about essentially actually a local funding issue with this kind of smoke abatement scheme that Helene Foster had cooked up, which then ended up in corruption allegations. And then one of the parties in the two power agreements leaving the whole operation, that party is propping up the government in Westminster. I mean, that's the ultimate irony to that. But I think Scotland, in a sense, is the model, and I think in a good way, we would see that kind of model pushed out on a county council level or city council level in England over the coming years.
So, Peter, you're gazing into the crystal ball.
Well, I understood your question to be, do we need a sort of, or part of your question to be, do we need a sort of Thatcher-type debate on our European policies or the future of post-Brexit? And I think my answer to that would be, until about 2.5 years ago, most people in Britain couldn't have cared less about Europe. It wasn't at the in the sort of top 10 issues of people's concerns. And if you look at, I don't know to what extent this conference has been looking at the causes of Brexit. Why was it that the vote came out in the way that it did? My own view is that it had very little actually to do with Europe. It had a lot more to do with a perceived, well, certainly, it was essentially a white working class English vote in protest at years of austerity and by people who felt that they had been left behind by the establishment, by the elite, and by the whole process of globalization that Londoners felt very positive about. But if you are, a low-wage worker somewhere in the north of England, you feel less positive about, because, and this is where it might link up with the EU. Suddenly you have this wave of migration coming in, and the problem with that low-cost migration is they're not coming after your job, they're not coming after my job, but they might be coming after, my plumber's job. And it was essentially a protest about this. So I think what we need a debate about is not Britain and Europe post-Brexit. It's going to be, how do we tackle these absolutely fundamental problems which are affecting half the country, which has been left behind over the last 30, 40, 50 years by the deindustrialization processes inaugurated by Mrs. Thatcher.
But given the precarious state of the two big parties that we discussed in the course of our workshop, who would be the carriers of such a debate? Who could drive such a debate? It doesn't come out of the blue.
This is a very German question, isn't it? I mean, don't worry, we'll sort it out in Britain. We'll make it up as we go along.
Okay. Well, let's just wait. Okay. Thank you, Simon. Thanks. he has to catch a train, so sorry, has to leave. Okay, well, so we've done the round on the domestic situation. Perhaps we'll do a second round before we open it up to questions and ask about what do we foresee about the situation of the UK in the world. Again, we can use that metaphor about the missing anchor. Is the UK going to drift away from Europe? Because we know, for example, in trade there is these gravity theories that you inevitably trade with your nearest geographic partners. But what do we foresee? Let's try to gaze a bit into the crystal ball, and perhaps you want to start.
I'm afraid I'm quite pessimistic about this. I think we're going to see a Britain which is reduced in influence and which is poorer. And largely because if you look at the problems which we face in the world today, the problems of China's development, Trump turning in on, or turning America in, problems of climate change, all these problems are problems which we have a better chance of influencing and having our voice heard if we are working in cooperation with our European partners. So I'm afraid I see very little upside in this, in Brexit. The whole concept to me of global Britain was simply a false prospectus. As I said in my introductory remark, the world is moving in the opposite direction. The argument, if you remember, of the Brexiteers was Europe is not growing, China, the developing world, is growing. That's where we ought to be present. We ought to be cutting our links with Europe. Of course, this argument ignored why it was possible for Germany both to export 10 times more than we do to China and at the same time remain a member of the European Union. But that argument is in any case facing the fact that the world is moving, as I said earlier, in the opposite direction. So I'm afraid my view is a weaker, poorer and less influential Britain.
Can you offer a counter perspective, Helene?
You want me to be very optimistic now?
No, I don't. I want you to gaze into your crystal.
Well, I think one point which was raised here today, I can't remember who, but which I thought was very good and is worth repeating is, I think one problem with the whole debate is that the people who are responsible for and discuss questions of trade and trade regulations, and the people who discuss and are responsible for geopolitics and strategy, those are effectively, not just in Britain but everywhere, separate groups discussing these questions in separate rooms, when really these questions, trade and geopolitics, are very much linked. So the United Kingdom, if really this whole idea of global Britain and let's just be great buccaneers in the global system and trade more with Asia and forget about this old-fashioned European Union, even if you were going to do that, and I'm not a trade expert, I mean, good luck to them, but even if you succeed at doing that, it's very likely that political questions will be the consequence of that the UK will have to address. And that's just not a problem limited to the United Kingdom. I mean, we have this question with Hong Kong right now in Germany, this question of if we're tough on China because of the Hong Kong protests, will that damage our economy and our trading relationship with China? So these kinds of questions are questions that the United Kingdom is going to have to address. What's also interesting is the future of the Anglo-American relationship. As you said, the world is more moving towards protectionism, and trade experts have pointed out that very likely the United Kingdom is going to a certain extent, have to choose between a close trading relationship with the EU or a close trading relationship with the United States. Now, what will that mean in the long run politically? What will that mean for Britain's role in NATO, depending on what the US is going to do? with NATO. So again, not much grounds for optimism. What I'm trying to say is that you can't just treat trade as an apolitical question. The whole question of the liberal world order and systems like NATO and the Western Alliance, these two questions are linked. I'd just like to very quickly say something on the bilateral question on Anglo-German relationships, of which I am a huge champion. But I wrote this little essay about the Königswinter conferences earlier this year, and for that I interviewed lots of politicians and senior civil servants, both retired and still active, both in Britain and Germany. And the Brits I interviewed, some of them were Brexiteers, some of them were Remainers, so very different views on Brexit. But what literally every one of them said is, there is a problem inherent in the Anglo-German relationship, or British-German relationship, is that the Anglo-German relationship and the Anglo-European relationship have become interlinked for decades now. And in the future, because of Brexit, even though I personally may not like Brexit, the Germans have to learn that we need to disentangle these two questions. So the bilateral has to be separated from the British problems with the EU. And then, which makes sense in a way, because if Britain leaves the EU, then we have to put the bilateral relationship on a new footing. But then I put the same questions to all the Germans, and what, again, very different political views, what all of them said was, this is impossible. This is impossible to treat the bilateral relationship as a completely separate issue from the Anglo-European relationship, at least as long as the Brexit negotiations are still going on. Because there is this German fear of the bilateral relationship maybe eroding Germany's European policy. And as long as Britain is sitting on the other end of the negotiating table, that is a real problem. So, and I would agree with all the Brits to say that the Germans we have to get over Brexit, as little as we may like it, but how do you get over something which hasn't ended, probably isn't ending anytime soon, because even if there was a deal by the 31st of October, there would be years of future relationship discussions ahead. So to say something optimistic and constructive in the end, I would absolutely agree that civil society cooperation between the two countries is the way to go. And the Germans have, of course, to ask themselves how to just deal with the reality of Brexit, but it is a complicated and not an easy question.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to continue with that, because I think this is one of the central questions. From a historical perspective, because this has been pretty much with the Anglo-German relationships ever since the first UK EEC application. Especially under Wilson, when the UK wanted to have the bilateral relationship, and basically Germany always had to waver, because they knew whatever they did with the UK, France would be very suspicious about it, and they didn't want to sacrifice that. And I think this is one of the things that I think has never been fully grasped in the UK. Is my suspicion, because I think otherwise, for example, this whole David Cameron negotiating stance, I'm going to Merkel, I'm going to come back with concessions and all of that. I think that would not have happened if this had been fully grasped. But what does this mean for the future? I think for the future it's very interesting. I'm going to be like super optimistic again. And I'm going to preface that this is not necessarily what I personally believe. I'm just saying this because otherwise I'm going to get, labeled a neocon or something like that. But the thing is, there is a certain logic in what in an ideal world, the UK would be trying to do in a post-Brexit world, in an ideal world scenario. Because what we've been seeing since 1989, especially in an accelerated form now, is a dissolution of a very ordered international system, where in a sense you roughly knew what happened, you roughly knew the relationships and the alliances. It was all very clear. And I think what we're seeing now is a dissolution of that system. And this is where all the and the question is Brexit part of the dissolution, or is it even driving it forward, etc. But in that system, an argument could be made that actually a country that focuses on individual bilateral relationships is far more nimble and flexible to react to challenges and to form alliances, sometimes just very short term, than an operator like the EU, because it moves too slowly. And this is why this point with the bilateral, multilateral really matters, because form matters. I think this is something that some of the foreign policy analysis has been overlooked. Because some of the people, so Sir Christopher Mayer, who's like basically, I always get almost close to a heart attack when I read his tweets. But he is frustrated by, you can really tell this, by the lack of speed, by the lack of dynamism, because he thinks it's all the bloody bureaucracy is kind of ticking that through. And the thing is, if you want to have a decision and if you want to react, I have some sympathy for that. From the perspective of a policymaker and someone who wants to react nimbly to situations. The problem with that is, and this is now my pessimistic coda to this, you do need to have the capability and the capacity. And the problem is the UK does not currently have it, and it will probably even have it less in 10 years' time, because the army is already in a very bad state, the economy is not in a very good state, legitimacy is an issue as well on the social level. So this is the ideal type scenario. I can see where they're coming from, but I don't think it's realistic, because the hard power is just not there to back this up. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Three quick reflections, if I may. I mean, one is the flip side of the question, which is how will the EU develop? And that will make it interesting. And specifically in the area around sort of foreign security defence policy, there are different possible trajectories. One would be around closer integration, extension of qualified majority voting, there would be significant obstacles in getting there. I'm often uncertain what the role of neutral states would be. I think in probably a more diverse European Union, it would be harder to develop in that direction. And another possibility is that more is done on a more ad hoc basis or outside the formal institutions of the EU. And it was interesting when Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer was talking about a European Security Council, for example, she foresaw the UK's involvement in that. And that was quite a difficult time in the Brexit negotiations. So it will be interesting to see where that ends up. But I think there are reasons to think that the relationship and there will be a deep partnership on security, defence, foreign policy issues in the future. Huge issues around as well, around just issues of substance. I mean, if we think about just some of the challenges at the moment, from Iran to the Sahel to Russia and Ukraine, those are areas where, regardless of the Brexit situation, foreign affairs ministries from the FCO to Germany to France to Poland to beyond need to work together, and it remains the case that the UK, I think, is the only EU member state spending 0.7% of GDP on overseas development aid and 2% of GDP on defence, and so the UK hopefully will be an important partner there. And just I think it's really important in Germany to note as well, when we face the Salisbury attacks, the solidarity from Germany, again, at a very, very difficult time in the Brexit negotiations, was really, really appreciated. I think that gives us some heart. Coming back to, if I may, Helene's challenge just briefly on the bilateral relationship. I mean, absolutely, no one would claim that the bilateral relationship has got easier in the context of Brexit. But just, I mean, a couple of ways in which we might take it forward. One is, I think, around the subnational level as well. I think the German embassy in London has got an initiative where it's sending its people out to the regions of the UK to get a better understanding of life beyond London. And actually, the British Embassy in Berlin has got a similar initiative going on as well. And when you look at, for example, education and cultural cooperation, as well as people-to-people links, actually doing that below the national level could offer some really good opportunities. And the other as well, just on some of the challenges, I was really struck by Sir Peter's comments about sort of investment in parts of the country that might feel left behind. Of course, that mirrors the debate in Germany as well at the moment about the need for public investment and some of the questions about East and West and also left behind areas of Western Germany. And so again, there surely is space for some dialogue there. So yeah, hopefully it can carry on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're now going to open this up, but since we don't record the rest of the discussion, let me briefly say that as the workshop draws to a close, I want to thank everybody who was involved. I think we had great discussions. I thought we had really valuable insights here, new ideas, and hopefully also new contacts. So many, many thanks to all of you who came here and participated, also to those who participated in the discussions. When the workshop started, I joked that it was meant to help those who had withdrawal symptoms after the Parliament had been prorogued. I'm very happy that now, as we draw to a close, we can say that the Scottish Court has stepped in and provided us with new material for discussion. So thank you all very much, and now let's open it up.